Thanks to our witnesses for being here. I'll just add briefly that the scope of the Salt Typhoon hack, as we understand it now, is truly breathtaking, truly breathtaking. You think about who this group, with the backing, as we understand it, of the Chinese government targeted. The staff members of the current Senate Majority Leader, the staff of the current Vice President of the United States, the current President-elect of the United States, the Vice President-elect of the United States. And to the extent we know, they were successful, perhaps, in garnering at least some of the communications of these individuals and their staffs. That this is truly extraordinary. And I hope it is a wake-up call for our entire government, our entire country, that we face with China a peer competitor of a kind that we frankly haven't seen in any of our lifetimes. And I hope it's also a wake-up call for these American corporations that for too long have been willing to sell out American jobs and America's security interests in order to make a quick buck, and in so doing have threatened all of us. If there's ever an advertisement for bringing our critical supply chains home, if there's ever an advertisement for bringing back core American manufacturing, if there's ever an advertisement for safeguarding American jobs in every sector, particularly these critical sectors that have to do with telecom and communications, this is it. This is it. The time is upon us now to make sure that we safeguard these critical industries and that we put an end to Chinese influence and espionage, which is trying to spread itself into every sector worldwide and right here in the United States. That's why this hearing is so timely. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Mr. Myers, if I could just start with you. You just referred to the Salt Typhoon attack as a sophisticated attack. Can you just elaborate? We still don't know a whole lot exactly of what's happened, at least from public reporting. You have extensive experience in this area, as you've just elaborated, for going back years now. So could you give us your sense of the sophistication level involved here, what we might be looking at in terms of ramifications?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. The sophistication isn't necessarily just to be measured in terms of how they get in, but what they do once they get in terms of the broad collection operations that China's been running in general. This really belies what their intention is, to collect large amounts of information that they can later exploit, whether that be political information, military information, or intellectual property. We've seen the Chinese over the past decade significantly up-level what they were doing. In the testimony, I refer to smash and grab operations, where they would break into one target, steal the thing that they want, and then leave. They are now maintaining persistent and enduring access to those targets in order to continuously collect large amounts of information and exploit downstream relationships to other interesting targets.
Exploit downstream relationships. Give me an example.
Sure. So with a lot of the telcos or ISPs that might be targeted, they have customer trust relationships, right? In other words, other organizations rely on those critical infrastructures for services or even shared services or web hosting, things of that nature. And they can exploit that trust relationship to then take on the persona of the initially targeted organization to exploit that trust relationship and use that to move to other areas.
So could the hackers impersonate particular individuals?
They could, yes.
Could they disrupt specific communications between particular people?
I'd say it's fair to say once they gain access to the telco or to the mobile provider, they could initiate or disrupt communications, and it's at the core of the system, right? So they'd be able to basically do anything that the telco could do.
You mentioned their intention being to exploit this information. What are some possible examples of that exploitation? What could we be looking at?
In the case of many of these Chinese adversaries, espionage would be the number one objective or motive in order to collect information. But as I mentioned with Vanguard Panda, and this has been covered pretty extensively elsewhere, there is a concern about pre-positioning. So if there was to be, for example, an escalation around Taiwan, could they use that access to disrupt logistics or disrupt military operations or critical infrastructure in the region that would potentially slow or disrupt the U.S. response?
Got it. Just on that point, does the use of a foreign network hardware in this country, like for instance Huawei, does that make these vulnerabilities worse? Is that something we should be particularly concerned about? What's the effect of that? How does that play into this?
Well, I think with a lot of that foreign technology, there's really no way to assess what's in there. In other words, there is a hardware supply chain concern there. They could have other microchips or other software running inside those devices, so this should be a huge concern.
Is that true of American companies whose hardware is manufactured in China?
Potentially, that could be part of the supply chain concern if it comes back with something different than what was spec'd. Yes.
Mr. President, let me just ask you on that point, and I've seen your report here, Which Ties Will Bind, which is extremely alarming in many respects, and I want to make sure I get some of these figures right. You say, based on your research, 80% of Apple's suppliers are based in China.
So that's almost exactly right. 80% of Apple's suppliers have at least one facility in China. That's not to say that all of them, that 80% are in China.
I got it. 95% of Apple's key consumer products are manufactured in China.
That's according to Financial Times story. That number is coming down right now, but when the report was written, those were the figures.
32% of Amazon's suppliers are based in China. These are huge numbers. I guess my question is, and you said in your testimony a moment ago, you don't advocate total or full decoupling. I'm just wondering, with numbers like these, are these companies able to decouple at all? I mean, this is an incredible dependency that you outline in your report.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think right now, part of my answer against decoupling is based on the fact that there is no way to completely decouple right now. If you sever manufacturing ties to China, the electronics industry ceases to function, essentially. So I advocate for a de-risking approach where these companies have to set up alternative supply chains in other countries, whether that's in Southeast Asia, South Asia, closer to the United States. It's going to take some time to build up these alternative supply chains.
What would happen if China invaded Taiwan successfully?
Can you clarify that?
Well, I'm just thinking about these supply chains and these companies' dependence on China, and then also the significance of Taiwan to the global supply chain in so many of these areas. I mean, what would the effect be on these companies and, well, let's say our national security broadly if China successfully invaded Taiwan?
Yeah, so obviously that is a very difficult question to answer. I would point you to a report by some researchers at the Baker Institute that I can share with you that tries to outline what an invasion of Taiwan might mean for corporations, national security, et cetera. I think it's very difficult to tell because we don't know how the Chinese government would react to an invasion and however we responded. They could react in a way to sever supply chains. They could interfere with supply chains. They could arrest corporate employees. There's a wide range of eventualities that I don't think anyone has really thought through fully.
I want to come back to this, but Senator Grassley, let me turn to you. Thank you, Senator. Mr. Stonefish, let me come to you and pick up the line of questioning that I was starting to discuss with Mr. Bresnik. Here we've got these companies, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Tesla, hugely, hugely invested in China and hugely dependent on China. And it would be one thing if they were, run-of-the-mill, no-name companies, but Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, these are arguably each of those three are monopoly-size companies that have significant control of vast sections of our consumer economy. So I guess my question is, how concerned should we be that 80% of Apple suppliers have a base in China, 95% of Apple's key consumer products are manufactured in China, a third of Amazon's suppliers are in China, 10% of Microsoft's China-based research lab produces, or I should say Microsoft's China-based research lab produces 10% of the company's research output. Those are massive numbers. Should we be concerned about this, or is this not relevant? Are we panicking unnecessarily?
Thank you for bringing these issues up. I think this is incredibly important. And I think there's this perception in DC that, everyone's talking about China. We're talking about it too much. I don't think we're talking about this nearly enough. I am really appreciative that you brought up the potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and a war with Taiwan. It's our very strong belief that the businesses you mentioned have constantly underpriced the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and they've long underpriced the risk of their very heavy China exposure. There's massive national security implications of the figures that you just described. And I think US government agencies need to be really aware of the various different interests and influences inside these corporations. You know, we're in an era of shareholder capitalism, and if it's in Apple's best financial interest to double down on China, where does that leave us, and where does it leave Apple consumers? I was using an Apple laptop right here, but also the US government. I think this is especially the case with Microsoft and the US government's relationship with Microsoft, and understanding that the depth of Microsoft's entanglement with China and with the Chinese Communist Party poses very real supply chain and security risks, and these are things that big US companies absolutely need to disclose.
You say that you think that these companies, there's a real risk that they underrate the significance of a potential Chinese invasion and takeover of Taiwan. Just elaborate on that, and what do you think are, what are some of the scenarios there that we should be prepared for?
So 3 different potential scenarios. One is business as usual, tensions abate. Second is a limited Chinese invasion of Taiwan, perhaps a la what Russia did in Ukraine in 2014, seize a few of the outlying islands, assassinate Taiwanese politicians, seize a little bit of territory and stop, or a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which could potentially lead to World War III. In the latter 2 scenarios, this would have massive upheavals for not only the global order, but US businesses and their interests in China, especially in the third scenario, where the Taiwanese semiconductor market gets knocked offline potentially, could drastically transform these companies and their share prices. And if this does happen, we expect a lot of companies will expect the US government to bail them out or to support them, when at this time, they're way too exposed to China for US national interests.
While the chairman gets ready to ask his questions, let me just ask you on that, on the scenario where the Taiwanese semiconductor production market gets completely knocked offline, which is a very real possibility for the scenario of a successful invasion of Taiwan. What would that look like for the United States? Just walk us through the potential ramifications there.
Initially, it would be devastating. What usually happens in instances like this, with the caveat that these things are very unpredictable, is that devastating weeks, months, and then people come up with alternatives. It's unclear what that will be, but US ingenuity and brilliance would allow for alternate supply chains and alternate possibilities. And so it wouldn't be a catastrophic end to the technological age, but it would have very, very major implications. And the companies that today are making the right de-risking choices and are making the right choices of moving out of China will be in much better shape if China does invade Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. I'll just add briefly that the scope of the Salt Typhoon hack as we understand it now is truly breathtaking, truly breathtaking. You think about who this group, with the backing as we understand it of the Chinese government,